we're going to get started now. Welcome to all of those of you online. More people coming in at the moment. Our department chair logging in there remotely. So welcome. This is for the defense of maybe potentially soon to be a Dr. Potash to join a family tradition here. Alex did his BS at the University of Vermont and master's and PhD here with us working on squirrels. He came to me as a quote carnivore ecologist, and we've done our best to show them that carnivores really weren't all that important, but nonetheless, he's managed to work it into his dissertation. I think we have predators as the first word of his presentation, so I couldn't break him of it no matter how hard we tried. So what we're going to do today is Alex is going to, we have sunshine laws here in Florida, and so because we've paid him, we get to find out what he's been doing for 5 years. So that's we've got 45 minutes equals 5 years. We'll find out what he's done for 5 years. Then you, as the public, both online and here, can ask him questions for about 10-15 minutes. After that, we will throw you all out, and then we, as his committee, will ask him some very pointed questions and make him very nervous and have him defend his dissertation. So that's what the plan is. Alex, are you ready?
No. All right, thank you, Dr. McCleary, and thank you to everyone who's here, to everyone who's online. I'm going to start sharing my screen. If everyone could just let me know, can you hear me all right online? All right, I see thumbs up. Good. So again, thank you to everyone for being here. I'm really excited to tell you all about what I've been working on for these past 5 and even really 7 years of my research here at the University of Florida. And so I'm going to tell you today about several studies I've done that have looked at how predators and prey and ecosystem function in the Southeast have all really been affected by anthropogenic disturbance. I think many of us are aware that we are currently living in a new geologic era, what we've termed the Anthropocene. And in the Anthropocene, we as humans have become the dominant structuring force on ecosystems. And one of the big effects that has come about because of our effects on the ecosystem has been defaunation, or the loss of animals, and especially the loss of large animals from our ecosystems. Terrestrial predators are particularly susceptible to this defaunation, where we see that 20 of the 25 largest predators are actually declining in populations. And of the 5 species whose trends are actually increasing or stable, we still see that they have lost substantial amounts of their original home range. So we see just how humans have drastically affected these predator populations. As we lose predators, we find these cascading effects that sort of run throughout the ecosystem. And we've seen that when we lose predators, things as sort of distant as fire ecology and disease ecology and soil nutrients, these things start becoming affected, even though what was changed in the environment were the predators, which were significantly sort of farther away on this scale. So we can sort of think of this conceptually as this via this model. And we can think about how each of these components of the ecosystem, how humans are affecting predators, how predators affect prey, how prey then affect ecosystem process. These are what we call direct processes, which is indicated by the solid line. But because humans are having effects on predators, which are then being translated to prey, we also see that there are these indirect effects indicated by the dashed lines. And each of these direct effects, each of these interactions presented a knowledge gap that we wanted to fill as part of this research. So for our first knowledge gap, we wanted to look at that direct effect of humans on predators. And specifically, we wanted to address how anthropogenic impacts are affecting predator distributions. Our second knowledge gap looked at that effect between predators and prey, asking how have changes in the predator community manifested in changes in prey behavior. And so again, although we were measuring this direct interaction between predators and prey, we were implicitly sort of also incorporating this indirect effect that humans are having on predator communities as well. And for our final knowledge gap, we wanted to identify how these changes in prey behavior that have resulted from changes in predator communities have changed the ecosystem itself. So looking at ecosystem processes that we believed would be affected by these ecosystem changes or these predator changes. And so overall, our goal was to sort of address each of these knowledge gaps individually in the hopes of sort of providing broader context and a broader understanding of really how humans fit into the global ecosystem, how we are part of ecology. We undertook filling these knowledge gaps by studying the Southeast. And we really wanted to study the Southeast both as a whole and in sort of experimental units. And so we considered the Southeast to consist of these states, and before people from Illinois and Pennsylvania get mad at me, this will make sense in just a few slides why we consider the Southeast to be such a large range. But we also wanted to look at specific study sites. So we did conduct experiments at Itchaway in southwestern Georgia and at Ordway Swisher, which is here in north central Florida. And we selected the Southeast because unbeknownst to me when I came here, the Southeast is actually very highly diverse. We have among the highest rates of mammal endemics in the US. And in fact, the Southeast fits the definition, Conservation International's definition for a biodiversity hotspot. And yet, the Southeast is woefully unprotected, particularly when we compare it to the West. We have very few protected areas. And as a result of this lack of protection, we have seen substantial change and due to humans, increasing human populations, and with that comes changes to the landscape, particularly in terms of land cover. So our original land covers, things like wetlands, forests, savannas, are being increasingly converted to cropland, agricultural land, and developed areas. And you can see just how much of that has occurred in the Southeast. So with this in mind, we sort of get to our first research question, which is, given that all of these changes are ongoing in the Southeast, we wanted to ask how predator distributions were responding to anthropogenic disturbance in a region that is going rapid ecological change. We already know that how some predators have been affected by all this disturbance. We know that the apex predators, the largest predators, those that have no natural predators themselves, things like mountain lions, wolves, we have lost those from the ecosystem already, almost entirely. And so because we have lost these apex predators, we are now left with a predator community that's primarily comprised of what we call mesopredators. Mesopredators are smaller than the apex predators typically. They are mid-level predators, and they show a very wide diversity in terms of their traits. And just overall, we find a lot more of them in a wildlife community than we would larger apex predators. So in terms of traits, we see variations in body size, fecundity, habitat breadth, and dietary breadth. And we wanted to know how these were impacting where we're finding these species. For these traits, we sort of, although they are continuous traits and we looked at each one individually, we kind of grouped them by their degree of generalism and specialism. And so we have species, mesopredator species, that serve more as generalist species, those with high fecundity, wide habitat breadths, wide dietary breadths, and compared to specialists, which have the opposite. We also looked at body size, which although that's not necessarily affiliated with specialism or generalism, we know that in general, larger animals are more susceptible to extirpation. So this was really how we contextualized our traits, the traits we were looking at in terms of how they were affecting distributions. So for our specific research questions, first, we asked, how does variation in occurrence, and when I say occurrence, I mean simply the presence or absence of a species, how does the variation in occurrence of mesopredators vary across the Southeast? How do variations in these species traits affect occurrence in the Southeast? And how do difference in biogeography and land cover affect their distributions? So the mesopredator community of interest that we were looking at consisted of 11 species. So we have bobcats, cats, coyotes, dogs, gray fox, opossum, raccoon, red fox, river otters, spotted skunks, and striped skunks. So a large, diverse community of mesopredators. And some of you may already be asking, what are we missing? There are a few species missing from this list that we would have expected to be part of the community here, particularly the weasels. And so we would have expected to include least weasels, long-tailed weasels, and mink as part of our community. However, and I'm sort of giving away the punchline already, we did not observe these species enough to even include them into our study. So that alone is quite telling, and it's something I'll return to in just a few slides. We researched these patterns using camera traps. So camera traps are remote cameras we place in the wild. We then wait for animals to come past them, and that gives us an idea of whether they occurred there or not. But what was really special about this project is that it was a collaborative approach. We collected data from 21 different studies conducted throughout the Southeast. We aggregated them together, and that allowed us to look at these occurrence patterns across a very large swath of the Southeast. Here you can see sort of a general map of where these cameras were located. Note that the size of the circle tells you how many cameras were located approximately in that area. And you can see that the number of cameras varied anywhere from a few dozen to several hundred. So again, this is a huge data set and one that we're really lucky to have in order to look at these patterns. Because we were aggregating so many different studies, we had to incorporate differences in study design and how those could affect detection. And we looked at that across 4 different variables for each study. We looked at how high the camera was set. We looked at whether it was set on burst mode. So that is when the camera was triggered, did it take one photo or did it take multiple photos? Was the camera baited? And was it set on a trail? And although I'm not going to get much into the detection and the actual functions that we went through, people who are familiar with occupancy modeling and occupancy modeling notation will note that our detection only model was sort of parameterized as such. If you're not familiar with notation, don't worry. This is sort of an Easter egg for the nerds out there. For the occupancy variables, we started with including these ecoregions. Now, ecoregions are defined by the EPA as contiguous regions that share sort of broad ecological components. And so regardless of geopolitical boundaries, these regions are more similar. And so now you can see why it is that our study area extended so far north and to the Midwest. These ecoregions, despite being the Southeast, quote unquote, really do extend this far north. And so we really wanted to incorporate these biogeographic patterns into our analysis. We also wanted to look at land cover because, as I said earlier, we are seeing massive changes in land cover around the Southeast, particularly seeing these forests and wetlands being converted to developed and agricultural land. And we wanted to see how the species were responding to that. We also included a coyote parameter. I'm not going to touch on this too much for the sake of time. To be honest, the results were not that interesting, but I did want to include it just to be thorough. We did want to look at coyotes as sort of the most dominant mesopredator and to see if they had effects on the rest of the community. And so our fully parameterized occupancy model looks like such. We have our occupancy portion represented by psi and our detection portion represented by p. So we can start to look at the results of this occupancy model. Here we see on the left, on the y-axis, we have our probability of occupancy. And on the x-axis, we have each of our species ranked from lowest to highest. The solid lines, the black lines, show the estimated occupancy from our models. And the gray bars show the naive occupancy, which is simply the proportion of sites where we observed each of these species. And I think the best way to look at these trends is to really split these two split this graph into sort of 2 regions. We have our winners and we have our losers. The winners, the dog, cat, coyote, opossum, raccoon, and bobcat, all had high predicted occupancy throughout the region, at least 20% or so. Whereas the losers, we all saw, were down around 5% or so. And these were the skunk, spotted skunk, red fox, otter, striped skunk, and gray fox. So we can really start to look at these groups of species separately. When we look at how the traits came out, how those described occupancy, we found that far and away the best describer of occupancy patterns by trait was habitat breadth. So if we look here, we see on the x-axis, the wider the habitat breadth, that is, the more types of habitats that we found these species in, that increased, or that correlated with increased occupancy overall. And again, we can see where these winners, so to speak, the ones farther on the right and with a higher habitat breadth, generally had higher occupancy than those losers, which had the lower, the narrower habitat breadth. As for the ecoregion, there are sort of several patterns we can draw from this, or conclusions we can draw from this. Note that in this figure, the lighter colors are indicative of increased occupancy overall. And we see that the regions where we have these lightest colors, the highest occupancy, are generally those with the most sort of topographic variation. So we see the Blue Ridge, the Piedmont, the interior plateau, these areas that are, thanks, sweetie, that are more topographically diverse tend to have increased occupancy among all species. But if we sort of split this up again by the winners and the losers, we can start to look at these patterns more specifically. And for these winners, the ones highlighted in green, we can see that overall occupancy patterns were pretty high throughout the Southeast. In contrast, the losing species were really quite rare throughout the area. So we see that there are these existing biogeographic patterns that are already sort of constraining where it is that we're finding these different species. For land cover, I know this is a very complicated figure, so I'm just going to sort of highlight the key points. When we looked at all the different land covers, we really saw that land cover had, whatever the land cover was, as it increased, we tended to see increasing occupancy across basically all species. But what was most interesting to us is that the developed and agricultural, the sort of disturbed land covers, that is the purple and blue, most species responded positively to those. So we actually find that a little bit of anthropogenic disturbance actually increased occupancy for most species. And I say this with a very large caveat, which is that we only looked at areas that had up to about 30% developed land in their vicinity. This is not a pattern that we would expect to hold if we went to more and more developed areas. So I just want to make it clear that we think some development may help, but it's unlikely that that would continue indefinitely. And so the main takeaways from this study is that we really are seeing this increased occurrence of generalist species at the cost of these specialist species. And what that really means is that we are experiencing community homogenization. That is, these species where we used to have very diverse mesopredator communities, they're now basically all coalescing to the same group of generalist species. And this is a process that we've seen is ongoing throughout the world. We also want to emphasize, again, that a little development actually may be good for wildlife, likely due to the additional resources that humans provide. And to return to these species that we were data deficient on, these were the specialist species. So it really emphasizes that the lack of data here is telling in and of itself. We were unable to even get enough data to model some of these, and that's telling us that they're already quite rare in the ecosystem. And so it's worth considering why we're not seeing these species overall and why we're unable to even look at their occupancy patterns, likely because they have already begun to become rare. Moving on to my second research question. This is now investigating sort of how predators are affecting prey behavior, and again, looking at that indirect effect of humans on prey behavior. We wanted to know how changes in predator communities are affecting that prey behavior. And before I get too far into this paper, I want to credit our collaborators, Dr. Mike Clinchy and Dr. Leanna Zanette, both from the University of Western Ontario. This project would not have happened without them. They gave us the equipment, they helped us with study design. This sort of study design that we used is their pet project, and I just want to give them that credit. I also want to point out that this paper has already been published. So if you're interested in this, please feel free to scan that QR code. It will take you to a PDF of the paper, and you can read more on it. We were looking at the effects of terrestrial predator loss on prey behavior, and specifically we wanted to look at anti-predator behavior. Anti-predator behavior, as it sounds, is the behaviors that prey engage in to reduce the probability that they are killed by their predators. And these anti-predator behaviors come in two flavors. We sort of have the proactive behaviors. These are generally avoiding the areas that animals know are risky. And there are reactive behaviors. So when an unpredictable risk occurs, these are the behaviors that the animals engage in to reduce their immediate risk. And these can be things like performing vigilance or standing up, looking around for predators, as well as fleeing or running away when they're scared. We also wanted to look at these predator-specific behaviors. So we know from some past research we've already done that there's a very big difference in the way that animals respond to terrestrial versus avian predators. And so for that reason, we wanted to look at how differences in responses to terrestrial, or differences in how animals responded to both terrestrial and avian predators. So for our specific research questions, Danny. For our specific research questions, we wanted to look at how prey respond both reactively and proactively to terrestrial predator extirpation. But we also wanted to look at how these reactive responses vary between predators with different hunting styles and different hunting domains, domains being sort of avian versus terrestrial. Our predictions were that the magnitude of reactive responses would decrease in areas without terrestrial predators, because in this area we had overall just decreased the risk by removing those predators, and we thought that would translate to a lower overall response. We thought that that avian predators would have the same level, or would cause the same response in prey, regardless of whether terrestrial predators had been extirpated or not, because they were unaffected by this terrestrial predator extirpation. And we also expected a proactive active shift towards the use, towards increased use of these terrestrial predator-free areas, which effectively present refugia. We did this study at Itchaway, a small private research area in Southwest Georgia. This is a longleaf pine system. So you can see here on the right what a longleaf pine system looks like. It is a fire-driven system. It has a very sparse open canopy and a very open understory. It's often described as park-like understory. And this really, excuse me. And one of the great things about Itchaway is that they have these terrestrial predator exclosures. These are 40-hectare exclosures paired with control sites. But these exclosures have a 1.2 meter wire fence and 3 electrified wires running around it. And these are used to keep out terrestrial predators, especially coyotes, wild dogs, and foxes. Then we were able to compare what was going on inside these exclosures to control areas where there was no manipulation of the predator community. We studied fox squirrels, and anyone who's been around me for a while knows these are my animals. So our study species, fox squirrels, these are the largest tree squirrels in North America. Because of their large size, they're really only predated upon by the largest predators in the system, those being coyotes, dogs, red-tailed hawks, and bobcats. And because of their large size, they actually spend most of their time foraging on the ground. And this is what allowed us to really control where we were going to investigate these behaviors and how we designed our study. So our study design, we used an automated behavioral response system, or an ABR. And this is the latest and greatest in wildlife technology. So while the rest of the world is, developing VR and all kinds of new technologies, the wildlife community has finally cracked the code on how to combine a camera with a speaker. I know it's big, but the way this works is that we would set up this camera speaker design. An animal would walk in front of it, trigger the camera so that it would start recording video. After a few seconds, the speaker would play some kind of call that we picked, and we would then be able to watch the response of the animal towards those calls. We selected 4 different calls that we wanted to look at the responses towards. For terrestrial predators, we looked at coyotes and dogs. For avian predator, we looked at a red-tailed hawk, or we used a red-tailed hawk shriek. And then as a control, we used the song of a Carolina wren, which we expected would have essentially no no effect on the squirrels because it's a non-threatening animal in the ecosystem. So I'm going to show some videos here. I hope the sound works. I apologize in advance if it's either too loud or too quiet, but this is indicative sort of what we expected, or of what we saw when we looked at the responses to the Carolina wren. So we were pretty surprised because while we expected to see essentially a null response to this non-threatening sound, we actually saw that towards these wren calls, fox squirrels exhibited high rates of vigilance. So in fact, after hearing a call, about half the time they spent was vigilant afterwards. They didn't flee as much, which is what we're seeing on this graph, the probability of fleeing at the top and the proportion of time spent vigilant on the bottom. But we did see sort of these high rates of vigilance. But interestingly, no difference between these controls or exclosures. This was really intriguing to us because having sort of guessed that we would not see any real response here, seeing a substantial anti-predator response just to this sound alone made us think that when we started to look at the predator calls, we would see sort of a much more substantial response. And so here is what we saw when we started looking at the terrestrial predators. I believe this is the coyote. So we see again, this vigilant response. When we look at dog, here's this a typical response to a dog call. So again, we see this vigilant response. And when we compare it to the wren, the response to the wren, we actually find that there was no significant difference between the vigilance response between wrens, coyotes, and dogs. They were all essentially the same. Same when it came to the probability of fleeing. There was really no difference between a wren call, a coyote bark, a dog bark. And this was surprising to us because, as I said, we really expected these dangerous predators would cause the squirrels to respond with an increased reactive response. And this concerned us because we sort of thought at this point, maybe our experiment had not worked. Maybe we had failed to incorporate some aspect of the environment that was really dictating the behaviors. But then we looked at the hawk calls. And so here is a typical reaction to a hawk call. There we go. So finally, we found a response. And what we found was that squirrels were almost 3 times more likely to run away after hearing a hawk call than towards any of the other ones. They also spent significantly more time vigilant, indicating that these hawks were the most dangerous predators, the most feared predators to the squirrels. And yet we found no differences in their reactive responses across exclosures and controls. And so overall, we can say that the loss of terrestrial predators did not affect their reactive responses. However, when we look at where our videos came from and we look at the distribution of our data, we see that a lot more of our data was coming from the exclosures than it was from the controls. And this indicated to us that there was a proactive response going on, that the squirrels were preferentially moving into the exclosures to take advantage of the lower terrestrial predator, the lack of terrestrial predators. And what we really wanted to know was if this pattern held over the long term. And so we looked at not just our study, but at long-term trapping over the last 3 years at HOA and found the pattern held over that long time. So we do see increased use of these predator-free areas indicating proactive responses, but not a reactive response. So the main takeaways here, we see that anthropogenic caused predator extirpations are changing prey behavior. We consider this study and our study areas, these exclosures, to be analogs in a way of urban green spaces. Think of things like parks and sprawling campuses, areas where terrestrial predators have largely been extirpated by humans, and yet we still find prey species like squirrels. And so we can really start to use this type of study design to isolate the impacts of urbanization and start to look at those individual effects, for instance, terrestrial predator loss, and how that's changing prey behavior. What this really raises is a question of how does impacting the space use by shifting space use, how does that change the environment? And so what we were really trying to look at is, we know that there's going to be a higher prey density in these areas. This could lead to increased competition. And even though we don't tend to think of squirrels often in terms of their human-wildlife conflict potential, there actually is quite a bit of potential for squirrels to have some conflict with humans. We could think about some of the times chewing on power lines and raiding bird feeders. But these are all things that may happen as a result of these changes in space use. For our final research question, we want to sort of look at this last component of our conceptual model and look at whether predators are indirectly affecting ecosystem process by constraining behavior. So again, looking at specifically the effect of prey, these prey species on ecosystem process, but implicitly looking at these indirect effects as well. For a model ecological process, we selected seed establishment. And we selected this because seed establishment is well, there's a body of literature behind it that we could use. And we know that seed establishment is a function of seed dispersal and seed survival. And that's what we're showing in this figure right here. Seed dispersal, which is this dotted line, decreases with distance from the parent tree. And at least in the Jansen-Connell model that I'm showing here as an example, survivorship increases and with distance. And as a result, we get this sort of unique establishment curve. And there are a lot of different ways that these curves can look like. But since we knew that it was seed dispersal and seed survival, we were able to look at species that we believed would affect both of those processes. Specifically, we were looking at nut-bearing trees, so think oaks that produce acorns, and again, looking at species, mainly squirrels, that interact with those seeds. The way we figured that these animals were interacting with these seeds would be by affecting survival as well as dispersal. So these granivorous animals would decrease survival simply by consuming the seeds, so destroying the seeds through consumption. But we also thought that for certain species that cache seeds, think squirrels that bury their acorns in the ground, that they could both increase survival by burying these seeds and possibly increase the potential for germination. But they would also be spreading the seeds around, basically increasing dispersal distance. The way that we incorporate predators into this model is that most seed consuming and caching animals are prey animals. They are prey to some other predator. And as a result, what we know of predator-prey ecology is that prey tend to forage in areas that they perceive as safe to reduce their risk of being killed while eating. But what we've also seen is that for caching animals, they will select areas for caching where they perceive increased predation risk. And this is thought to actually reduce the risk of other animals stealing their caches. So specifically, we wanted to look at how burying a seed affected seed survival and germination, how seed survival patterns compared to the patterns of seed dispersal and seed consumption by granivores through their caching and foraging behavior, and how perceived predation risk varied between areas where animals were consuming and caching acorns. Oh, Amanda's here. We predicted that buried seeds would have enhanced survival compared to the surface ones, to seeds that remained on the surface. We also predicted that seeds would be consumed closer to the bases of trees, whereas they would be cached farther away, again, consuming that closer to the tree would be a safer area than farther away. And the perceived risk would be greater at these caching areas than at the consumption areas. And to research this, we actually had to conduct 3 separate studies, one on seed survival, one on seed consumption and caching, and one on perceived risk. So for the seed survival, we set out these transects stemming away from turkey oak trees, which was our model tree. And we put acorns at increasing distances away from the tree, and we both buried them and left them on the surface. We would then return weekly to see what had happened, whether they had been consumed or had disappeared, had been taken. And this allowed us to look at overall survival of these seeds. For the seed consumption and caching study, we also took turkey oak acorns and we marked them. We marked them using fishing wire and some flagging. This is actually an earlier iteration of how we did it. And we would place these just at the base of a turkey oak tree. We would then leave and wait until some animal, typically a squirrel, would show up and do something with the acorns. For instance, cache them or consume them. And we would then return and look at the patterns that had occurred, what the characteristics of these caching and consumption sites were. And finally, for the perceived risk study, we used these points where we had found consumed and cached acorns, and we conducted a giving up density study. And a giving up density is simply a bucket of food where animals will visit, they will consume some amount, and when they will leave some food. And we go back and we measure how much food they left. And if they left more food, we consider that an area that they perceived more risk. So when we look at our results, we'll start with seed survival. And we did find that buried acorns had much greater survival than the ones that were left on the surface, higher median survival and overall higher survival. Interestingly, we also found that of the 400 or so acorns that we put out for this study, 20 of them survived the length of the entire study, and 16 of those 20 were from the buried group. Of those 16, 14 acorns germinated. So we had 14 acorns that germinated from the buried group and none from the surface group. So we really see just how important burial is to seed establishment. As for the seed caching and survival, the key here is that we saw caching occurred at about the same distance from a tree that we saw seed survival and mortality and germination occurring. But what we overall saw is that granivores, these granivorous mammals, were consuming the seeds much, much closer to trees. So they were having a very strong effect at that short distance away from those trees. And lastly, when we look at our giving up density experiment, we found, as we predicted, that cached sites, there was more food left there, indicating there was a greater perceived risk at those cached sites compared to the consumption sites. So if we put this all together, we can sort of see that burying is really essential for acorn survival and for acorn germination. We also know that acorn burial is primarily accomplished by squirrel caching. There's really no other way that these seeds can get buried. There's just no other real mechanism. And we know that cache and consumption points differ in their predation risk. So this leads us to say that predators are could plausibly direct seed establishment by constraining prey behavior. And I say plausibly because we only tested this one hypothesis. There are a variety of other reasons that this could have occurred, but we see that this pattern is supported, or our hypothesis was supported, and that predators may be driving these seed establishment patterns. And this also just raises sort of the broader question: what happens to seed establishment patterns when humans are changing these predator communities, really linking it from the very top of that conceptual model to the bottom. And so here, I'm going to bring this back to the end, or at the end here, I'm going to bring back our conceptual model, just to remind everyone how it is that we sort of predicted all of these cascading effects would transmit through the ecosystem. And we can start to sort of build on this model based on our findings. So for our first question, how do humans affect predators? We see that human effects can create areas with and without predators. So we already see how we can have these sort of diverging outcomes. For our second question then, of asking how changes in predator communities affect prey behavior, we found that there were differences in prey behavior. So we can see that these outcomes continued to cascade, that in areas where we have predators, we see different behaviors than areas where we don't have predators. And then lastly, we asked, does behavior matter? Does it change the ecosystem? And what we found is that yes, differences in prey behavior can lead to different ecosystem processes, different outcomes, at least in seed establishment, but likely in other processes as well. And so to fully contextualize this research, what we've done, I really want to point out that humans play a crucial role in the environment. And many of these roles we don't actually fully understand. I often think about a professor I had in undergrad who used to say that humans are both a part of and apart from the environment. And I think my research kind of disagrees with that. I don't think we are apart from the environment. I don't think we can separate our effects from what goes on in the ecosystem. Whatever we do as humans in the Anthropocene, when we are controlling the environment, it cascades down throughout the ecosystem. And it really helps contextualize what we as humans do in the overall, in the environment overall. All right. And with that, I'm going to do my acknowledgements. I apologize to everyone I've left off, which is too many people that I could not remember. I want to start by thanking my committee, particularly Dr. McCleary, who has been my advisor for 7 years and will continue to be my boss for at least another, but also Dr. Connor, Dr. Lashley, and Dr. Zableski, who's I believe is online. I want to thank all the faculty and administration of the department who have helped me out throughout the last 7 years. I want to thank everyone at Ordway Swisher and the Jones Center, particularly at Ordway, because they allowed me to work on their property at no cost because I did not have enough funding. So huge shout out to them. All of my friends, all of my lab mates, everyone I've gotten to know during my time here, I think I counted, there have been 23 McCleary lab members who have come and gone since I've been here, all of whom have left some kind of indelible mark on my experience. I want to thank all of my volunteers. I believe I wrote in my dissertation, in my acknowledgements, that this dissertation would be little more than a proposal without the work that these volunteers did. It never would have happened without them. So a huge thanks. My family, my other friends, my parents are here. I can't really say enough to acknowledge what they've done for me. And I just have to put that out there. I want to thank my daughters. Thank is probably the wrong word because I wouldn't say they've helped, but they have been there. And they have added to my life in ways that I can't even express. Again, maybe not helpful, but helpful to my own life in general. And lastly, and most importantly, I need to thank my wife, who has done more than I can even say. While I've been in the office till 2 in the morning writing my dissertation, she has been taking care of a toddler and a now 3-week-old. Whatever I have done, whatever struggles I've had are nothing compared to what she has. And in true irony, I scheduled my defense today on our 6th wedding anniversary. So fittingly. So overall, or I say most of all, thank you, Freddie. Happy anniversary. I love you. And with that, I would love to take some questions. Thank you.
Online, raise your hand if you have any questions, and here you guys can just jump right in if you have questions. You stop the share.
All right, Katie.
Hey Alex, you crushed it, bro. It was awesome. Congrats. I was just wondering, did you use different types of sounds when you were doing your fleeing versus vigilance work, and also were you worried about any kind of like acclimating to the sounds or animals getting used to and no longer being scared of potential predator sounds?
Yeah, that's a great question, Katie. Thank you. We did. So for each of those 4 calls, we had 8 different exemplars. And that was specifically to avoid what you said, the potential for habituation over the period as they were experiencing the same call. We at least wanted them to get different individual calls, but from the same species. And so, yes, we had different individuals, 8 different individual calls for each one. And then the other thing we did is we only conducted these studies at each site for about 2 weeks, and then we moved them to a different location. And that also helped reduce the probability that these squirrels were going to become habituated to these sounds.
Can I follow up on that question? Because that's super, by the way, awesome work,
Thank you.
beautiful story,
Thank you.
pretty awesome. Did you try other sounds that were maybe non-animal sounds? Just for fun to see how they responded?
I did not. I think that's a great question. And I know there are people who have done that. I mean, it's interesting to include sort of anthropogenic sounds. There was a study that came out several years ago where they sort of developed a phantom road and simulated noise, road noise, finding that was really affecting the animal's behavior. So we did not look at that, but I think that would be a great place sort of to move this forward, is to start looking not just at non-animal sounds, but looking at animal sounds for animals that are no longer in the ecosystem. So, how does a squirrel respond to a mountain lion or a wolf, which should have effects on other portions of the ecosystem that would, again, cascade down into that behavior. So I think there are a lot of different ways that we can use this latest and greatest technology to better understand the prey behavior and the ecosystem as a whole.
Yeah, because I was thinking that maybe they have adapted to just be vigilant to any sound that is above certain decibels, so you can just try, like an artificial made AI generated sound above, I don't know how many decibels, and see if they respond to that. And maybe they respond with fleeing only for those that they're like absolutely certain that are threatening their survivorship. Cool stuff.
And that's why we looked at both vigilance and fleeing, why we wanted multiple metrics. I think with Dr. Lashley, maybe we could start playing some AC/DC and see how they respond to that. And maybe we can do that later. But yep.
Hey, so firstly, I wanted to say that this is actually a lot better than some of my classes over the years. So great job. Really amazing. I did want to ask about one part of the presentation, which was you mentioned that the loss of terrestrial predators did not affect the response of the fox squirrels.
The reactive response, yes.
Oh, okay. So can you elaborate on that a little so I understand that better? Because I know that later you said, anthropogenic caused predator extirpation did affect their behavior, but I didn't understand that part.
That's a great point. So yes, to be clear, in terms of reactive behavior, we saw no difference towards any of the different calls towards hawks, coyotes, dogs, or wrens. There was no difference in their reactive behavior, whether they were vigilant or whether they fled, regardless of whether they were inside the exclosures or whether they were outside, whether they were in the controls. But when we looked at that proactive response, how are they using space? We saw that they were much more likely to be observed inside the exclosures, indicating that they were using that space significantly more. And so what we're saying is that overall, we see this sort of broad scale, proactive change in space behavioral change, but that's not actually affecting their reactive response. And so they're maintaining that response sort of on the off chance that a coyote were to get into that exclosure. They are still responding with an appropriate anti-predator response to that reactive, unpredicted threat.
Oh, okay. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much. That solves it for me.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, Dad, hit me.
As the non-ecologist here, what are the better questions? I mean, the purpose of a dissertation ultimately is to fund the next set of better questions.
My defense starts in like 10 minutes, Dad.
Yeah. I'm just curious, I mean, based on what you learned, you had 5 years of funding to continue something along these lines. What would the best question be to pursue?
boy, I don't know about the best, but I can think of sort of several different directions where I would want to continue this, or I will continue this. And I think where the meat really is in that final chapter. How are these effects, these cascading effects, actually impacting the ecosystem? Because it's all well and good to look at, changes in behavior. It's fun, it's interesting, it's what I like to do. But, given that we are in the Anthropocene, we are experiencing, massive biodiversity loss, defaunation throughout. What we really want to look at is how are these effects actually impacting the ecosystem? And that helps us decide what can we do about it. And it helps us predict, as this ongoing biodiversity crisis continues, we can start to predict now where these effects are going to occur and how and the magnitude and whatnot. So I think where I would take this research further is to keep looking at those different types of ecosystem effects. I used seed establishment as a model process. As I showed in that other figure, everything from fire to carbon flux to biodiversity. These are all the things that we've started to attribute to losses of predators overall. And I think more and more research sort of focused on how this very small segment of the biomass period, these predators at the very top, how their relatively small presence can have such a large effect in places that we really wouldn't have expected. So that isn't a specific question that I would ask, but it is sort of the direction where I think this research in general should be heading.
So we're gonna take two more questions and then we're gonna wrap it up. Looks like you've got Jed and Justine.
All right. Yeah, Jed, go ahead, and then Justine.
Hey, great. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Nice job, Alex.
Thank you, Jeff.
Fantastic. Really nice presentation. Quick question about the first part, your first chapter, I'm assuming.
Mhm.
The occupancy results showed an outlier, which seemed to be bobcat, which seemed to have like really high occupancy compared to the other species. I mean, I'm from the Northeast, and we have kind of a different pattern where other species among those that you recorded generally occur in higher occupancies than bobcat. So I guess the question is, did the bobcat results surprise you at all? And then secondly, maybe more specifically, did you test at all how well these models performed, maybe with a separate set of data or some bootstrapping technique?
Yeah, great question. So to answer the first part, about the bobcats, if we look, and I want to go back to the slide, I'm a little afraid that I will screw everything up, but I will give it a shot. The bobcats themselves were almost entirely driven by detection, and that was what really surprised me. See if I can get back there. Oh, did I go too far? There we go. So if we look at the differences in naive occupancy versus full, you can see just how much of a gap there is, how much that primarily through the detection function, we accounted for, or we found that was what was driving the increase in bobcat occupancy overall. So I would say overall, I was surprised, just given how much larger of a occupancy presence that we observed with them. But I really do think that has more to do with our study designs and how each of these individual studies was set up. Often they were designed for bobcats, and so I think that was leading into why we found such an inflated occupancy value. As for whether we tested it, we have not done that yet. What we have started to look at a little bit more is sort of the difference between coyotes and dogs, and we started to run with that a little bit farther, because one thing I didn't really point out throughout this chapter is that dogs and coyotes showed almost exactly the same response. The magnitude of response, the direction of response, it was almost exactly the same. And so that raised to me an interesting question of, if coyotes and dogs are being affected by the environment the same way, are they having the same types of impacts on the community? And so that's where we started to get into sort of some multi-species occupancy, some conditional modeling. That has kind of fizzled out, but that was where we wanted to sort of take this a little bit further and see if we could sort of derive additional trends from these data.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. And Justine, you had your hand up. Please go.
I do. I have a lot of questions, but I think I'm going to narrow it down to the ABR work just because I know Mike is sitting in the room. So you said that with the squirrels that you looked at both fleeing and vigilance, and forgive me for not being a squirrel person, but I know with gray squirrels, they'll utilize their tails for a form of communication with one another. In your videos as a response, did you happen to see that with the fox squirrels as well?
Oh, you're actually hitting on something that's sort of one of my big regrets, which is when I started looking at these squirrel responses, and we saw it in one of the videos, you may have noticed that when the call went off, the squirrel just puffed up its tail, piloerection, same as when we get goosebumps. And one of the things I really wanted to look at was that response, that sort of tail puff as sort of a true biological indicator of fear. And in the end, I don't actually remember why, but we weren't really able to incorporate this into our models, sort of just served as a side project that I may still go into. As for communication, we didn't really look at communication, and that's primarily because fox squirrels, unlike gray squirrels, which are really social species that exist in large groups, fox squirrels are more sort of individual, independent. And so we wouldn't have expected much in the way of communication. So that's why we focused on their behavioral response as opposed to their potential communication response.
Awesome, thanks. Really great job today.